The year was 1878, and the border territory between Texas and New Mexico felt less like a place on a map and more like a fever dream that God had forgotten to wake up from. The wind out here did not just blow, it scoured. It carried a grit that settled into the deep lines of a man's face and the hollows of a woman's spirit. The land was vast, stretching out like a solemn oath that no one had ever bothered to verify, broken only by the jagged spine of the mountains in the distance and the scrub oak that clung to the dry earth for dear life. It was late October, and the nights had already turned sharp and unforgiving. At the R relay station, a dusty collection of timber buildings serving as a pause for cattle drives before the long push north. The sun was bleeding out against the western horizon. The air smelled of sagebrush, manure, and the metallic tang of impending frost. Eliza Bennett walked into this world with the stiff, deliberate gait of someone who had walked 100 miles in boots that did not quite fit. She carried a canvas bag that had been patched with gray thread on brown fabric, and on her hands, she wore gloves that did not match. One was soft deerskin, the other rough wool. She was somewhere between 22 and 24 years old, though the dust on her face made her look older. Or perhaps it was the exhaustion that pulled at the corners of her mouth. She approached the main bunkhouse, where the light from a kerosene lamp spilled yellow and sickly onto the dirt. She did not knock. She simply stepped into the frame of the open door, letting her shadow fall long across the floorboards. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. 5 or 6 men were scattered around the room. 2 were playing cards at a wobbly table. Another was whittling a piece of cedar near the stove. They all stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that usually preceded a fight or a funeral. Liza did not flinch. She had learned long ago that looking away was the first step to being devoured. She kept her chin level and her eyes fixed on the man who looked like he gave the orders. "I hear you need a cook," she said. Her voice was raspier than she intended, worn down by days of not speaking to a living soul. The man at the table, a burly fellow with a beard that looked like steel wool, leaned back in his chair. This was Wade Carver, the trail boss. He narrowed his eyes, looking her up and down, not with desire, but with the weary calculation of a man trying to figure out how much trouble she was going to be. "We ain't running a charity ward, Miss," Wade said. His voice sounded like gravel grinding under a wagon wheel. One of the younger cowboys, a thin man with bad teeth whom they called Slim, snickered. "Maybe she ain't looking for charity, boss. Maybe she's looking for company. Women who come drifting in off the trail this time of night always have a story, and it usually ends with a husband chasing them with a shotgun." Liza turned her head slowly to look at Slim. She did not blink. She looked at him until his grin faltered and died. "I can cook," she said, turning back to Wade. "I can wash. I can mend clothes so you don't look like beggars. And I don't talk unless I have something to say." Wade chewed on the inside of his cheek. The ranch had been without a decent cook for 3 weeks. Ever since the last one, a drunkard named Pete had ridden off with a bottle of whiskey in the payroll box. The men were eating beans straight from the can and biscuits that could crack a tooth. "You got a name?" Wade asked. "Liza, just Liza. That is all you need to write on the pay ledger," she replied. Wade threw his cards on the table. He stood up, and he was a mountain of a man, tall and broad-shouldered. He walked over to her, stopping just outside of striking distance. He smelled of horse sweat and tobacco. "One night," Wade said, holding up a single thick finger. "You get tonight. You make dinner. If the boys don't get sick, and if the food tastes better than saddle leather, we can talk about wages tomorrow. You fail. You keep walking." "Fair," Liza said. "And just so we are clear," Wade added, his voice dropping lower, "a woman alone out here creates tension. I won't have my men fighting over you." Liza adjusted the grip on her canvas bag. "If you feed men well enough, Mr. Carver, their mouths are too busy chewing to make trouble. I will need flour, salt, lard, and coffee. And one rule." "You're in no position to make rules, girl," Slim called out from the corner. Liza ignored him. She kept her eyes on Wade. "No one touches my things. I have a small corner, and it stays mine. I do my work. You do yours." Wade studied her face for a long moment, looking for the fear that usually lived in the eyes of strays. He found none. He nodded once. "The kitchen is through the back. The pantry is unlocked. Don't make me regret this." Liza nodded and walked past them. As she moved through the room, she felt their eyes on her back, some predatory, some curious, some just indifferent. She pulled her mismatched gloves tighter. She had run from a town where her reputation had been sold for the price of a lie, and she had sworn she would find a place where no one knew the price of her dignity. This dirty, wind-swept ranch would have to do. The kitchen was a disaster. It was a lean-to addition at the back of the bunkhouse, with a cast-iron stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the war. Grease coated the walls, and a pile of unwashed tin plates sat in a basin of gray, stagnant water. A rat scurried across the floorboards as she entered, vanishing into a hole near the woodpile. Liza set her bag down in the cleanest corner she could find. She did not sit down to rest. She did not cry. She took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Survival was not a feeling. Survival was a verb. She found the water barrel and hauled a bucket to the stove. She scraped the old ash out of the firebox, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She built a fire, coaxing the flames from kindling until the iron began to tick with heat. She found a block of soap that was mostly lye and scrubbed the basin, then the plates, then the table. Through the window above the sink, she could see the yard. The twilight was fading into a deep, bruised purple. Men were moving about, tending to the horses and the cattle in the holding pens. That was when she saw him. He was standing near the corral fence, repairing a section of rail that had been kicked loose. He was distinct from the other cowboys, not just in dress, but in the way he held himself. He wore buckskins that had seen years of hard use, and his dark hair was tied back, though a few strands escaped to frame a face that looked like it had been carved from mahogany. He was a Comanche. She knew that much from the beadwork on his sheath and the way he moved economical, silent. While the other men shouted and joked, he worked with a quiet intensity. He lifted a heavy cedar post as if it weighed nothing, slotting it into place. He paused for a moment, and even from this distance, Liza could see he wasn't looking at the horses. He was scanning the horizon, his head tilted slightly as if listening to the wind. He was a man who expected trouble to arrive with the sunset. Liza watched him for 3 seconds, then turned back to her flower. A man like that was dangerous in a different way than the loud ones inside. The loud ones wanted attention. The quiet ones just wanted to survive. She understood that. She found a sack of cornmeal and a jar of molasses. There was salt pork in the cooler box, and a bag of dried beans that needed soaking but would have to do with a hard boil. She worked with a rhythm that quieted the noise in her head. Chop, stir, knead. By the time the dinner bell rang, an old iron triangle hanging by the back door, the kitchen smelled different. It didn't smell like grease and stale beer anymore. It smelled of hot cornbread rising in the oven, of pork sizzling in its own fat, and of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The men filed in, loud and shoving, until they smelled the air. Then the noise dropped. They lined up with their tin plates, looking at the food with suspicion that quickly turned to hunger. Liza served them. She did not smile. She ladled the beans and pork, placed a square of steaming cornbread on each plate, and poured the coffee. "It's hot," she said simply. Wade Carver was the first to eat. He took a bite of the cornbread, then a mouthful of beans. He chewed slowly. The room waited. "Well," Wade grunted. He looked at Liza. "It ain't poison." It was the highest compliment he could give. The other men dug in, the sound of spoons scraping tin filling the room. For the first time in months, the bunkhouse felt like a home rather than just a place to sleep. Liza did not eat with them. She stayed by the stove, wiping down the counter. She noticed the Comanche man entered last. He did not push to the front. He waited until the others were seated. He held out his plate, and when she served him, he did not look at her chest or her hands. He looked her in the eyes. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and startlingly sharp. They were the eyes of a scout, a man who noticed everything: the way she favored her left leg because her boot was worn, the way she kept the butcher knife within easy reach. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, and moved to the farthest corner of the room to eat standing up. "Hey, Chief," Slim called out, his mouth full of bread. "Better thank the lady. This is better than that raw deer meat you eat, ain't it?" The Comanche did not respond. He continued to eat, his back to the wall, ignoring the jab as one might ignore a buzzing fly. "His name is Mako," Wade said, his voice cutting through the laughter. "And he does twice the work you do, Slim, so shut your mouth and eat." Liza noted the name, Mako. It sounded hard and soft at the same time. Later that evening, after the washing up was done, the mood in the bunkhouse shifted. The men were full, and with full bellies came the talk of business. The wind was howling outside now, rattling the window panes, making the warmth inside feel precious. Liza was drying the last pot, trying to make herself invisible in the shadows of the kitchen, but the voices drifted clearly through the open doorway. "I heard the sheriff was out at Miller Place today," one of the older hands said. "Miller's gone," Wade replied, lighting a pipe. "Sold out last week. Packed his wagon and headed for California. Sold out. Miller swore he'd die on that land. He changed his mind," Wade said grimly. "Or someone changed it for him. He got a price, I reckon." "Who bought it?" There was a pause. The striking of a match flared, illuminating Wade's face. "Silas Boone," Wade said. The name landed in the room like a dead bird. Even the air seemed to grow colder. Liza froze, her hand gripping the dish rag. She knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name, though usually whispered. Silas Boone was not just a cattleman. He was a force of nature, a man who arrived in a town with a suitcase of money and left with the deeds to half the county. He didn't use guns if he could use paper, and he didn't use paper if he could use a judge he had bought. "Boone," the older hand muttered. "He's buying up everything from the river to the ridge. He says he wants to run cattle, but cattle don't need that much rock and dust." "He ain't after cattle," Slim said, lowering his voice. "I heard talk in town. He's looking for a route. I think there is gold in the hills, or silver maybe. Wants to clear the land so he can bring in the mining equipment without anyone squawking about grazing rights." "To do that," Wade said, blowing a ring of smoke, "he's got to clear out more than just the ranchers. He's got to clear out the rest of the Comanche who are still hunting the high pass." Liza instinctively looked toward the corner where Mako stood. The Comanche man had finished his meal. He was leaning against the rough timber wall, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. When the name Silas Boone was spoken, he did not move a muscle. He did not flinch. But Liza, watching from the shadows of the kitchen, saw his eyes. The indifference vanished. In its place was something cold and terrifying. His pupils seemed to contract, focusing on nothing and everything at once. It was the look of a sky turning green before a tornado touched down. His hand, resting on his belt, tightened just enough that the knuckles turned white. He set the cup down on a barrel. It made a soft clink that sounded incredibly loud in the sudden quiet of the room. "Boone is sick," Mako said. His English was clear, with a cadence that was slow and deliberate. It was the first time Liza had heard him speak. His voice was deep, resonating in his chest. Slim laughed nervously. "Careful. Mako, Boone owns the sheriff. If you talk like that, you might find yourself on a wanted poster." Mako turned his gaze to Slim. "Paper does not stop a bullet," he said. "And paper does not make a thief into a king." He pushed off the wall and walked toward the door. As he passed the kitchen, he paused. He looked at Liza again. For a second, she thought he would speak to her, perhaps warn her, but he only held her gaze for a heartbeat before stepping out into the cold, windy night. Liza let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She looked down at her hands. They were red from the hot water and the scrubbing. "All right, boys," Wade announced, standing up. "Bunks. We got a herd coming in at dawn. First light comes early." The men grumbled and moved toward their bunks. Wade walked to the kitchen doorway. He looked at the clean counters, the stacked plates, and the fire banked down for the night. "You can stay," he said to Liza. "Pay is $20 a month and a roof, but you keep your nose out of the men's business. And stay away from the Comanche. Mako is a good hand, but he's got his own war going on. And you don't want to be in the crossfire. I'm just here to cook, Mr. Carver," Liza said softly. "See that you do," Wade said. He turned down the lamp, plunging the main room into semi-darkness. Liza retreated into the small pantry room Wade had pointed out earlier. It was barely big enough for a cot, but it had a door with a latch. That was a luxury she hadn't had in a long time. She closed the door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. She sat on the edge of the cot, listening to the wind battering the ranch house. She thought of the name Silas Boone. She thought of the way Mako's eyes had darkened, like a storm blocking out the sun. She had come here to hide, to be invisible, to be nothing more than a pair of hands that peeled potatoes and scrubbed floors. She wanted to be valued for her work, not her past. But as she lay down on the scratchy wool blanket, pulling her knees to her chest for warmth, she had a sinking feeling in her gut. This place was not a sanctuary. It was a powder keg, and the fuse had just been lit. Outside, the wind howled over the vast, empty land, sounding like 1,000 ghosts screaming for justice. Liza closed her eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. She kept seeing the warrior's face, and the way he looked at the horizon as if he were waiting for the end of the world. Or perhaps the beginning of a new one. She pulled the mismatched gloves off her hands and placed them under her pillow. Tomorrow, she will make biscuits. She would survive. She would be the best cook this God-forsaken territory had ever seen. Because out here, in 1878, being useful was the only thing that kept you alive. But deep down, she knew that biscuits and silence wouldn't be enough. Not with a man like Silas Boone coming for the land, and a man like Mako standing in his way. She was just a leaf caught in a whirlwind, and she would have to learn how to fly before she hit the ground. The routine of the ranch had settled around Eliza Bennett like a coat that was slightly too large, but offered necessary warmth. 7 days had passed since she had walked into the kitchen of the Double R. 7 days of scrubbing grease from cast iron and earning her place with biscuits that rose high and light. The men had stopped staring at her with predatory hunger and started looking at her with the simple, animal gratitude of creatures who were finally being fed. However, peace in the territory was as brittle as a dried leaf. It cracked under the slightest pressure. It was late, well past 10 o'clock, and the wind had picked up again, rattling the loose shingles of the bunkhouse. Liza was in her small pantry, finishing the inventory of the flour sack by the light of a single tallow candle. The ranch was asleep, save for the low murmur of the night watch and the shifting of horses in the corral. Then came the sound. It was not the rhythmic, easy trot of a cowboy riding the perimeter. It was a desperate, uneven gallop, the sound of a horse being pushed beyond its limits. Liza blew out the candle and stepped into the kitchen. Through the window, she saw a shape hurtling out of the darkness. A rider slumped low over the neck of a roan mare that was frothed with white sweat. The horse skidded to a halt in the yard, its hooves kicking up a cloud of dust that the wind immediately snatched away. The rider tumbled from the saddle, hitting the hard earth with a sickening thud. Liza did not wait. She pushed open the back door and ran out, her boots crunching on the gravel. As she drew closer, the moonlight revealed a shock of pale hair and a dress that had once been blue but was now stained with mud and darker patches that looked like blood. "Help!" Liza cried out, her voice cutting through the wind. "Someone help!" She knelt beside the fallen woman. When she turned the woman over, Liza felt the blood drain from her own face. It was June, who had shared a cramped room with her in the boarding house 3 towns over. June, who had laughed loud and dreamed of marrying a banker. Now, June looked like a broken doll. Her breath came in ragged, Wet gasps. Wade Carver and Slim burst out of the bunkhouse, rifles in hand, wearing their long johns and boots. "What in God's name is this?" Wade bellowed. June grabbed Liza's wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by terror. With her other hand, she shoved a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped bundle into the folds of Liza's apron. "Take it!" June hissed, her eyes wide and unfocused. "June, what happened? Who did this?" Liza asked, her hands trembling as she smoothed the hair back from her friend's forehead. June pulled Liza closer, her voice a rasping whisper that only Liza could hear over the wind. "Don't trust the paper. Liza, don't trust the smile. And for the love of God, don't let them take what is in your bag." "Who?" Liza demanded. "Who is coming?" "Boone," June choked out. "The paper. It proves—" Before she could finish, June's eyes rolled back and her head lolled to the side. She was not dead, but she was deep in the dark water of unconsciousness. "Get her inside," Wade ordered. Holstering his rifle, he scooped June up as if she weighed nothing. "Slim, check that horse. See if it's branded." Liza stood up, the heavy bundle pressing against her stomach like a stone. She shoved it deep into the large pocket of her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. She followed Wade into the bunkhouse, her mind racing. June was not the type to ride across the desert at night. June was soft. Whatever had driven her here was terrified enough to kill. They laid June on a spare cot. Liza immediately went to work, demanding hot water and clean rags. She cut away the sleeve of June's dress and found a graze from a bullet on her upper arm and deep bruising on her ribs. She was tending to the wound, her hands steady despite her fear. When the sound of more horses filled the yard, this time, it was not a single desperate rider. It was a posse. The door to the bunkhouse swung open, banging against the wall. Sheriff Harlan stepped in. He was a man of medium height with a face that looked like it had been molded from soft clay and then left out in the rain. He wore a tin star on his vest, but everyone knew the star was polished with Silas Boone's silver. Behind him stood two deputies, men with hard eyes and hands resting on their gun belts. "Evening. Wade," Sheriff Harlan said, tipping his hat. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on the unconscious woman on the cot, and then sliding over to Liza. "I see you found our fugitive." "Fugitive!" Wade stood up, blocking the sheriff's view of June. "This is a hurt woman. Harlan, she rode in half dead." "She is a thief," Harlan said, his voice smooth and devoid of sympathy. "Stole a substantial sum of money and some private documents from Mr. Silas Boone's office in town. We have been tracking her for 20 miles. Liza felt the weight of the bundle in her pocket. It felt hot, as if it were burning through the fabric. "She didn't steal anything," Liza said. Her voice shook, but she forced it to steady. "She is my friend." Harlan turned his eyes to Liza. He smiled, and it was the smile June had warned her about, a smile that did not reach the eyes. "Ah, the new cook. I heard a stray had wandered in. Birds of a feather, I suppose." He moved a step closer to Liza. "If she is your friend, then maybe you know where the stolen property is." "I don't know anything," Liza said. "I just know she is bleeding." "Search the girl," Harlan ordered one of his deputies. "Hold on," Wade growled. He stepped between the deputy and Liza. "You ain't putting hands on my cook. Harlan, not without a warrant or proof. This is the Double R, not a saloon." The room went deadly quiet. The cowboys, who had been watching from their bunks, sat up straighter. They were rough men, and they didn't like the law much. But they liked Wade. Harlan sighed, as if dealing with children. "Wade, don't make this hard. Silas Boone is very upset. He is looking to expand his holdings, bringing jobs to this territory. He doesn't take kindly to thieves or those who harbor them. If this girl is hiding stolen goods, she is an accessory. That is a hanging offense in some counties." He looked at Liza again. "We will take the thief with us. The doctor in town can patch her up in a cell. As for you, Missy, if I find out you are holding out on me, I will be back, and I won't be as polite." Harlan gestured to his men. They pushed past Wade and grabbed June from the cot. Liza lunged forward. "You can't take her. She needs rest." One of the deputies shoved Liza back. She stumbled, catching herself against the table. She watched helplessly as they dragged June's unconscious body out into the cold night. "You have until morning." "Wade," Harlan said from the doorway, "if I find out you are protecting a criminal enterprise here, Boone will shut this relay station down faster than you can spit." The door closed, leaving silence in its wake. The atmosphere in the bunkhouse had changed. It was no longer a home. It was a trap. Slim looked at Liza with a sneer. "I knew she was in trouble. A woman like that brings nothing but misery. We ought to check her bags ourselves and throw her out before Boone burns us out." "Shut your mouth, Slim," Wade said tiredly. He looked at Liza. "Did she give you anything?" Liza looked Wade in the eye. "She gave me a warning." Wade rubbed his face with his calloused hand. "Liza, I can't protect you from Boone. He owns the judge, the sheriff, and half the bank. If you have what he wants, you need to get rid of it, or get gone." "I have nowhere to go," Liza whispered. "Then you better pray," Wade said. He blew out the lamp, signaling the end of the conversation. Liza retreated to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now. She went to the flour bin, a large wooden chest in the corner. She dug a hole deep in the white powder and buried the oilcloth bundle there, covering it smoothly. She sat on the floor, her back against the cool wood of the bin. She was a thief now, a fugitive by association. The fragile life she had started to build the smell of yeast, the warmth of the stove. The respect of the men was crumbling into dust. A shadow detached itself from the darkness near the back door. Liza gasped and reached for the knife on the table, but a hand caught her wrist. The grip was firm but not painful. It was Mahko. He had not been in the bunkhouse during the confrontation. Or if he had been so still that no one noticed him. He released her wrist and stepped back. "The sheriff is a liar," Mahko said. His voice was low, barely a rumble in his chest. Liza rubbed her wrist. "He says June stole money. He says what Boone pays him to say," Mahko replied. He looked at the flour bin. "Show me." Liza hesitated. "Show you what?" "The thing you buried in the flour. The thing that smells like oil and fear." Liza stared at him. He had seen, or he had sensed it. There was no lying to a man who could track a lizard across stone. Slowly, she stood up and dug the bundle out. She shook the flour off the oilcloth and placed it on the table. She unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its pages torn from a larger book, and a thick envelope. Liza opened the ledger. It was covered in rows of numbers and dates. "I don't understand," she said, tracing a line with her finger. "It is just payments." Mahko stepped closer. He did not touch the paper. He leaned over, his dark hair falling forward, his eyes scanning the columns. "October 10th, $500. To Judge Holloway. October 12th, $200. To Surveyor Evans." He pointed to a folded map tucked into the back of the ledger. It was a hand-drawn map of the valley, but the lines were wrong. "This line," Mahko said, his finger hovering over a jagged ink mark. "This is the dry creek bed to the north. Boone has drawn his property line 5 miles past it." "So, he is stealing land?" Liza asked. "He is stealing water," Mahko corrected. His face hardened, the muscles in his jaw bunching. "This creek feeds the high pastures. It is where the antelope go in winter. It is where my people camp when the snows come. If Boone claims this, he cuts off the water. He starves the game. He forces the Comanche to move further into the Badlands, where there is nothing but rock." He looked at the envelope. Liza opened it. Inside was a letter, signed by Silas Boone, instructing the notary to falsify the dates on the deeds. It was proof of a conspiracy that spanned the entire county. "This is not money," Mahko said softly. "This is a weapon." Liza felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "June died for this for land. Land is life," Mahko said. "Boone wants to build a road for the mines. He needs the Indians gone. He cannot kill us all with soldiers, so he kills us with paper. He signs a paper, and suddenly the water belongs to him. He signs a paper, and suddenly Standing on the earth of my fathers is a crime. Liza looked at the documents. She saw the signatures, the red wax seals. They looked so official, so civilized, yet they were more violent than a knife in the dark. "I have to burn it," Liza said, reaching for the stove. "If they find this on me, they will hang me." Mako's hand shot out, blocking her path. "If you burn it, Boone wins. The water is gone, my people starve, and your friend ran into the dark for nothing?" Liza stopped. She looked up at him. He was close enough that she could smell the scent of pine pitch and leather on him. His eyes were fierce, demanding something from her that she wasn't sure she had to give. "I am just a cook," she whispered. "I ran away from my last town because I couldn't fight. I can't fight Silas Boone." "You are already fighting," Mako said. "You just haven't decided if you want to win." He stepped back, giving her space. "Boone knows the papers are here. He will not wait for morning." The sheriff was the polite knock. "The next knock will be fire." Liza looked around the kitchen. This was her sanctuary. "Will they hurt the ranch, hurt Wade?" "Boone destroys what he cannot buy," Mako stated. Liza looked down at the ledger. She thought of June's terrified face. Don't let them take what's in the bag. If she burned it, she was safe. She could walk away. She could find another town, another kitchen. But she would know. She would know that she had let them win. She would know that her safety was bought with June's blood and the starvation of Mako's people. She had spent her whole life being pushed around by men with power. Men who thought a woman's worth was written on a bill of sale. "I won't let him have it," Liza said. Her voice was stronger this time. Mako watched her. A flicker of respect passed through his dark eyes. "Then you cannot stay here." "Where can I go? The sheriff is watching the road." "I know paths the sheriff does not see," Mako said. "I can take you to the high country." "To my people. It is hard. It is cold. But Boone's law does not reach there." "Why would you help me?" Liza asked. "Because you hold the truth," Mako said. "You keep the letter, I keep the path. That is the trade." He extended a hand. It was a gesture of equality, not charity. "But we must leave now. Tonight." Liza looked at his hand. It was scarred and brown. A hand that knew how to work and how to kill. To take it was to leave behind the world of white picket fences and rules she understood, and to step into a world she had been taught to fear. She reached out and took his hand. It was warm and rough. "Okay, pack only what you can carry while running," he instructed. Liza moved quickly. She grabbed her canvas bag, stuffed the ledger and letter inside, wrapped in a clean shirt. She added a bag of dried beef, a small sack of coffee, and her mismatched gloves. "Ready," she said. Mako moved to the back door and cracked it open. He froze. "Too late," he whispered. A bright orange glow flared up in the window above the sink. It wasn't the sunrise. It was coming from the hay barn, just 20 yards from the kitchen wall. "Fire!" someone shouted from the bunkhouse. The roar of the flames was sudden and terrifying. The dry hay caught like gunpowder. In seconds, the barn was a torch, sending sparks showering over the roof of the kitchen. Smoke began to curl under the doorframe, acrid and choking. "They want to flush you out," Mako said. "Like a rabbit from a hole." Through the roar of the fire, Liza heard the heavy thud of hooves, many horses, men shouting. Gunshots rang out, not aimed to kill, but to panic the cattle and add to the chaos. "Get out here, girl!" a voice screamed from the yard. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a rougher voice, one of Boone's hired guns. "Bring out the bag and you don't burn." Liza looked at Mako. Panic flared in her chest, hot and tight. Mako didn't panic. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the wall and smashed the window on the side of the kitchen that faced away from the fire and the yard. "The smoke will hide us for 10 seconds, he said, turning to her. "Do you trust me?" Liza looked at the flames licking at the timber walls. She looked at the man who had offered her a trade, a piece of paper for a life. "I trust you," she said. "Then run," Mako commanded. He boosted her through the broken window. She landed in the dirt, coughing. Mako vaulted out behind her, landing silently. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the shadows of the creek bed, away from the screaming men and the burning barn. Behind them, the fire roared toward the sky, a beacon of destruction. Liza didn't look back. She clutched her bag to her chest and ran into the black mouth of the night, following the Comanche warrior into the unknown. The inciting incident was over. The war had begun. The night was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a throat filled with smoke and shouting. Liza Bennett hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her teeth, but she did not stop to check for bruises. The heat from the burning barn was a physical weight, pressing against her back, urging her forward. However, survival was a habit Liza could not break. Even in the midst of panic, her mind clung to the practical. As they scrambled up from the dust, the wind shifted, driving a sheet of sparks directly onto the wooden shingles of the kitchen lean-to. "Run," Mako commanded, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. Liza hesitated. She looked at the kitchen, her kitchen. Inside were the sacks of flour she had organized, the dried beans she had soaked, the order she had carved out of chaos. If that was caught, the men would have nothing come winter. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy water barrel standing near the back porch, its wood slick with moss. It was heavy, weighing perhaps 80 pounds, but adrenaline gave her muscles the strength of iron. She shoved it hard, tipping it over. The water gushed out, soaking the dry earth and the base of the kitchen wall, creating a damp barrier against the encroaching sparks. "Leave it," Mako hissed, grabbing her arm. "They need to eat," Liza shouted back, coughing as the smoke swirled around them. She grabbed a smaller sack of cornmeal that had been left on the stoop to cool and swung it over her shoulder, adding its weight to the canvas bag already strapped across her chest. She was not a damsel fainting in the heat. She was a woman who knew that starvation killed just as dead as a bullet. A gunshot splintered the wood of the porch railing inches from her face. That was the signal to abandon stewardship and embrace flight. Mako did not ask again. He gripped her shoulder, his fingers digging into the wool of her coat, and propelled her toward the darkness of the tree line. They ran. They did not run like children playing tag. They ran with the desperate, lung-burning intensity of prey. Mako led her away from the main road, diving into the labyrinth of the dry creek bed that snaked behind the corrals. The ground here was treacherous, a mess of loose shale and twisted mesquite roots that sought to snare a careless foot. Liza stumbled, her boot catching on a rock, but she kept her balance. The air was filled with the sounds of destruction, the screaming of horses in the paddock, the shouts of Boone's men, and the terrifying crackle of dry timber being consumed. But down here in the cut, the shadows were deep. Mako moved with a silence that was almost unnerving. He did not thrash through the brush. He flowed through it. He seemed to know before his foot touched the ground whether the earth would hold or slide. He kept his body low, presenting no silhouette against the firelit sky. Liza tried to mimic him, forcing her breathing to be shallow and quiet, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every time a twig snapped under her boot, she expected a bullet to tear through her back. They ran for what felt like an hour, though it might have been only 20 minutes. The sounds of the ranch faded, replaced by the whistle of the wind through the canyon and the crunch of their own footsteps. The terrain grew steeper as the creek bed rose toward the foothills. The wind turned colder, carrying the scent of impending rain. Finally, Mako slowed. He held up a hand, signaling her to stop. Liza leaned against a sandstone boulder, her chest heaving. Her legs felt like lead, and the strap of her bag had rubbed a raw spot on her shoulder. She looked at Mako. He was barely breathing hard. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked to the side, listening to the night. He was not checking for pursuit with his eyes, but with his instincts. He did not offer her false comfort. He did not say, "We are safe." He simply nodded to himself, satisfied that the darkness behind them was empty, then looked at her. "You run well for a cook," he said. It was not a compliment, merely an observation. "I have had practice running," Liza rasped, straightening her coat. "We cannot stop here," Mako said. "The wind carries scent. If they bring dogs, they will find us. We must cross the water." He led her further up, to where the dry creek met a trickle of actual water, a small tributary fed by the mountain springs. He stepped into the icy water, walking upstream to hide their tracks. Liza followed, gasping as the cold soaked through her worn leather boots, numbing her toes instantly. They walked in the water for another mile until the terrain turned into a jagged scar of rock and scrub oak. Mako found a shallow overhang beneath a limestone ridge, a natural shelter protected from the wind and the rain that had begun to fall in freezing sheets. "Here," he said. Liza collapsed onto the dirt floor of the overhang. She was shivering violently now, the adrenaline crash combining with the wet cold to rack her body. She wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering. Mako moved efficiently in the dark. He did not light a fire. A fire would be a beacon. Instead, he cleared the ground of sharp stones and laid out a thick wool blanket he had carried rolled across his back. He looked at Liza. In the dim light, she looked small. The defiance she had shown at the ranch was gone, replaced by the trembling of a woman pushed to her limit. He stepped toward her, the blanket in his hand. He reached out, intending to wrap it around her shoulders. Liza flinched. It was not a small movement. It was a violent recoil, her body jerking back against the rock wall as if he had held a hot brand. She drew her knees up to her chest, her eyes wide and white in the darkness, staring at his hands. "Don't," she whispered. The word cracked in the middle. Mako froze. His hand hovered in the air halfway between them. He looked at her terror, a terror that had nothing to do with Boone or the fire or the cold. It was an old terror, a scar that had never healed. Liza pressed herself harder against the stone. "Don't touch me, please." She knew how she looked. She looked like a hysterical woman, but she couldn't stop the memory that flooded her blood, the memory of the town she had fled. The whispers of men who thought that because she had no husband and no father, she was public property. She remembered the heavy hand of a merchant on her shoulder, the way he had squeezed, assuming her poverty was an invitation. She remembered realizing that to them, she was not a person. She was a thing to be haggled over. Mako lowered his hand slowly. He did not look offended. He did not look confused. He looked at her with a clarity that was disarming. "I am not one of those men," he said. His voice was quiet, barely audible over the rain drumming on the stone above them. Liza stared at him, her breath hitching. "I do not take what is not given," Mako said. He dropped the blanket on the ground between them. "And I do not bargain for warmth." He took 2 steps back, putting a deliberate distance between them. He sat down near the mouth of the overhang, his back to her, facing the rain and the dark. He pulled his knees up and rested his arms on them. A sentinel guarding the entrance. "The blanket is dry," he said, not looking at her. "Use it. I am used to the cold." Liza looked at the blanket, then at the broad back of the Comanche warrior. He was shivering slightly. Too, she could see the tension in his shoulders, but he did not move to claim the warmth. He gave her the dignity of space. Slowly, Liza reached out and took the blanket. She wrapped it around herself, pulling it tight. The wool smelled of horse and wood smoke. It was the warmest thing she had ever experienced. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not answer, but his shoulders relaxed a fraction. Back at the Double R Ranch, the fire had been contained, but the damage was done. The barn was a smoking ruin. The skeleton of the roof collapsed inward like the ribs of a dead beast. The smell of charred wood and wet ash hung heavy in the air. The men were gathered in the main bunkhouse, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes wide with the shock of violence. Sheriff Harlan sat at the table, dry and clean, a stark contrast to the exhausted cowboys. Beside him sat a man who did not look like he belonged on a ranch. He wore a suit that cost more than the ranch made in a year, and his hands were soft and manicured. This was Mr. Blackwood, Silas Boone's attorney. Wade Carver stood in the center of the room. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead where a piece of falling timber had grazed him. and his face was a mask of fury. "This was arson," Wade growled, pointing a shaking finger at the sheriff. "Your men, Harlan, or Boone's hired thugs. I saw them riding off." "Careful with your accusations. Wade," Harlan said, picking at a loose thread on his cuff. "We are investigating. It seems your cook, that girl. Eliza was careless with the stove, or perhaps she set it herself to cover her escape." "That is a lie," Wade spat. "She tried to save the kitchen. I saw the water barrel tipped over. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat. The sound was dry and precise. He pushed a stack of papers across the table toward Wade. "Mr. Carver, let us not dwell on the unfortunate accident, Mr. Boone is very concerned about the safety of his neighbors. He understands that running a ranch in these lawless times is difficult. He wants to help." Wade looked down at the papers. "What is this?" "An asset protection agreement," Blackwood said smoothly. "It transfers the liability of the land to Mr. Boone's holding company. In exchange, he provides security, funds for rebuilding the barn, and a guarantee that the cattle drive will not be molested." Wade picked up the paper, his hands trembling with rage. "This ain't protection. This is a sale. I signed this, and Boone owns the water rights. He owns the grazing leases. I become a tenant on my own land." "You become a partner with a powerful man," Blackwood corrected. "Which is better than being a man with a burned-down ranch and no cattle." "I won't sign," Wade said, throwing the paper back on the table. Harlan stood up. He was not smiling anymore. He walked over to Wade and leaned in close. The sheriff smelled of bay rum and rot. "Wade," Harlan said softly, "you are interfering with a criminal investigation. That girl, Liza, stole valuable property. By harboring her, and by refusing to cooperate with the victim of that theft, you are making yourself an enemy of the law." "The law?" Wade laughed bitterly. "You ain't the law. Harlan, you are just a dog on a leash." Harlan's hand moved faster than a snake. He backhanded Wade across the face, the heavy ring on his finger tearing the skin of Wade's cheek. Wade stumbled back, colliding with a bunk. The other cowboys surged forward, but the sheriff's deputies leveled their shotguns. "Sit down," Harlan barked. He turned back to Wade. "You will sign, Wade, maybe not tonight, but soon. When the winter comes and you have no hay because your barn burned down, you will sign. Until then, stay out of my way." Harlan turned to his deputy. "Post the notices in town tomorrow, and send riders to the other stations." In the rocky overhang, the rain had settled into a steady, rhythmic drizzle. Liza had stopped shivering. The warmth of the blanket and the drop in adrenaline had left her feeling hollowed out, but her mind was sharp. She watched Mahko. He had not moved from his post. "Why?" she asked. Mahko turned his head slightly, his profile illuminated by a flash of distant lightning. "Why what?" "Why help me? You could have taken the papers and left me. You could have run faster alone." Mahko was silent for a long time. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a strip of dried meat, tearing it in half and tossing a piece to her. "Boone does not just want land," Mahko said, chewing slowly. "He wants to erase us." "The Comanche." "The people," Mahko corrected. "Boone buys the sheriff. He buys the judge. He uses the paper to say that the land where my father is buried belongs to him. He puts up fences. He poisons the water holes to kill the wolves. But he kills the deer, too. And without the deer, my people have no meat for the winter." He turned to face her fully now. His eyes were dark pools of old anger. "They call us savages because we fight with bows, but Boone fights with ink, and that is a crueler weapon. A bow kills a man. Ink kills a generation." Liza pulled the blanket tighter. She thought of the ledger in her bag, the rows of numbers, the signatures. She had thought it was just graft men stealing money from men. She hadn't realized it was a siege. "He wants to push you into the desert," Liza said, understanding dawning on her. "If he controls the water along the ridge, you have to move west, into the salt flats, where there is nothing." Mahko nodded. "He wants us to die quietly, so he can build his road and dig his mines without the army having to waste bullets." Liza looked down at her hands. They were calloused, stained with soot and dirt. She was a cook. She made biscuits. She mended socks. She was not a soldier. But she looked at Mako, a man who was watching his world disappear one signature at a time, and she felt a spark of something hot in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was indignation. "That isn't right," she said. It was a simple sentence, childish almost, but in the dark, it sounded like a gavel striking wood. "The world is not right, Lisa," Mako said. "It is just... No." Liza shook her head. "June died because of this. She didn't die for just is. She died because she wanted to stop it." Mako looked at her with renewed interest. "You have the spirit of a badger, small, but digging deep." "I am not a badger," Liza said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time that night. "I am a cook, and I hate waste. Boone is wasting lives." "Then we stop him," Mako said. "Tomorrow. We move higher. I have family in the Canyon of the Red Rocks. Old Nita is there. She will know how to read the rest of the papers. We need to know exactly who Boone has bought, so we know who we can trust." "Is there anyone?" Liza asked. Mako looked out at the rain. "The earth, the wind, the horse. Everything else is a gamble." The sun rose gray and reluctant the next morning, illuminating a world washed clean by the rain but stained by the sins of men. In the town of Dry Creek, 10 miles south of the ranch, Sheriff Harlan stood outside the telegraph office. He held a hammer and a stack of stiff paper posters. He walked to the main notice board. Right next to the schedule for the stagecoach, he hammered a nail into the top of the poster, driving it deep into the wood with a single, violent blow. The poster was fresh, the ink still smelling sharp. It featured a rough description. Not a drawing, but the words were clear enough. "Wanted for grand larceny and theft of private property. Eliza Bennett, height 5'4", hair brown, eyes brown, armed and dangerous, known to consort with hostiles." And at the bottom, in bold block letters that seemed to scream across the dusty street, "Reward $500 dead or alive, contact Sheriff Harlan or Mr. Silas Boone." A crowd began to gather. $500 was more money than a cowboy made in 2 years. It was enough to buy a small farm. It was enough to make a good man hesitate and a bad man load his rifle. Harlan stepped back, admiring his work. He lit a cigar, the smoke drifting up into the cold morning air. "Find her," he said to his deputy, "and tell the boys. I don't care if she can talk when you bring her in. Just bring the bag." Far away, in the shadow of the limestone ridge, Liza Bennett woke up. She did not know that she now had a price on her head. She only knew that the sun was up. She was alive, and the Comanche warrior was already awake, checking the load in his Winchester, watching the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. She stood up, shaking the dust from the blanket. She checked her bag. The ledger was safe. The flour was dry. "Let's go," she said. Mako nodded. He did not wait for her, but he did not leave her behind. He simply began to walk, setting a pace that she could match, leading her away from the safety of the known world and into the heart of the fight. The journey into the high country was a lesson in silence and endurance. Mako led Liza Bennett away from the familiar dusty plains and up into a landscape of jagged red rock and scrubbed cedar, where the air grew thin and tasted of pine resin. They rode for 2 days, moving mostly at night to avoid the patrols that Silas Boone had undoubtedly sent out. By the time they reached the hidden encampment, Liza felt less like a woman and more like a piece of dried leather, toughened by the wind and the sun. The camp was not a village of teepees, as the dime novels described, but a temporary shelter of brushwood wickiups tucked deep into a box canyon where the echo of a horse's hoof would die before it reached the rim. There were perhaps 30 people here, the remnants of a band that had refused the reservation agencies. They were thin, their clothes worn, but their weapons were clean and their eyes were alert. When Mako rode in with a white woman behind him, the camp went still. Children stopped playing with sticks in the dirt. Men reached for rifles, not aiming, but holding them ready. An older woman emerged from the largest shelter. This was old Nita. Her face was a map of deep canyons, her hair the color of wood smoke, She walked with a cane made of twisted ironwood, but her back was straight. She stopped in front of Mako's horse and looked up at Liza. Her eyes were black and unreadable, neither hostile nor welcoming. "You bring a guest, Mako," old Nita said. Her English was broken, but clear. "Does she bring a storm, or does she bring the truth?" Liza slid down from the horse. Her legs wobbled, but she forced herself to stand tall. She remembered June, and she remembered the fire. "I bring the truth," Liza said, her voice steady. "And I bring proof of the thief who is stealing your water." Old Nita studied her for a long moment, looking past the dirt on Liza's face to something deeper. "Truth is heavy," the old woman said finally. "Come, sit. We will see if you are strong enough to carry it." For the next 3 days, Liza lived a life stripped of all pretense. She did not ask for special treatment, and none was given. She learned that survival was a series of small, deliberate acts. She learned how to find damp sand in the dry wash that indicated water beneath. She learned to start a fire with virtually no smoke, using dry bark and feeding it one twig at a time. She saw the suspicion in the eyes of some of the younger men. One warrior, a scarred man who watched her like a hawk, spat on the ground whenever she passed. To them, she was the enemy, a representative of the race that lied with paper and killed with diseases. Liza did not argue with them. She worked. She mended a torn shirt for a child. She helped grind mesquite beans into flour. She showed them she was not a princess to be served, but a pair of hands willing to bleed. The turning point came on the 3rd evening. Mako and Liza sat by a small fire. The stolen ledger spread out between them on a flat rock. The firelight danced over the columns of numbers. "Here," Mako pointed to a recurring entry. "October 4th, $50 to Thomas Miller." "Miller is the clerk at the land office," Liza said, squinting at the handwriting. "And here, October 6th, $100 to the same man." And the next day, Mako traced the line. "The deed for the watering hole at Painted Rock changes hands. It goes from public domain to Boone Cattle Company." Liza pulled the letter from the envelope, the one June had died to protect. "And this letter confirms it. It is an instruction from Boone to the sheriff, telling him to ignore any complaints from the original settlers. He calls them squatters." "He calls us vermin," Mako said, his voice flat. "This proves premeditation," Liza said, her mind racing. "It proves conspiracy. If we can get this to the federal judge in Santa Fe, or even the marshal in the next district who hates Boone, we can stop the sales. We can invalidate every contract he has forced people to sign." A shadow fell over them. It was the scarred warrior who had spat at her. He kicked dirt onto the edge of the ledger. "Paper," the warrior sneered. "White man's magic. You think paper will stop bullets? You are a fool. Mako, she is a spy. She leads them here." Mako stood up. He did not shout. He moved with the slow, terrifying grace of a mountain lion uncoiling from sleep. "She brought the paper that proves Boone is stealing the Painted Rock water, the water your mother drinks. What have you brought today?" "Stonehand, a rabbit." The warrior stiffened, his hand drifting to his knife. Liza stood up too. She did not hide behind Mako. She looked Stonehand in the eye. "I am not a spy," she said. "I am a cook who got tired of seeing men like Boone eat while everyone else starves. You can kill me, and Boone will still take your water. Or you can let us finish this, and maybe you can keep your home." Old Nita, who had been watching from the shadows, thumped her cane on the ground. "She speaks with the tongue of a person who has lost something," Nita said. "Let her be. The paper is a weapon. We need all the weapons now." The tension broke, but the danger remained. They had the evidence, but evidence was useless in a canyon. They had to go back. The night before their planned departure, the wind died down, leaving a silence so profound it felt like pressure against the ears. Liza sat on a ledge overlooking the canyon floor. The stars were impossibly bright, diamond dust scattered on black velvet. She was terrified. The adrenaline of the escape had faded, leaving a cold dread in its wake. Tomorrow, they will ride back into the lion's den. Tomorrow, She might be hanged as a thief. Mako found her there. He did not startle her. His presence was like the arrival of a night itself, natural and inevitable. He sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his arm. "You are shaking," he observed quietly. "It is cold." Liza lied. "It is 50 degrees, Mako corrected. "You are shaking because you are thinking about the town." Liza wrapped her arms around her knees. "I am thinking about the sheriff. I am thinking about how easy it is for them to twist the truth. I am just a woman, Mako. In their world, I am nothing." "In this canyon, you are the one who carries the fire," Mako said. He turned to look at her, his profile sharp against the starlight. "You are not nothing." Liza looked at him. He was a warrior who had seen death 100 times. Yet he sat with her as if she were the only important thing in the universe. The way he looked at her, it wasn't the hungry look of the cowboys, nor the dismissive look of the town merchants. It was a look of recognition. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear of Boone, but from a sudden, terrifying closeness. "I am 24 years old," Liza said, her voice barely a whisper. The words tumbled out before she could check them. "And I have been running since I was 16. I ran from an uncle who hit me. I ran from a boss who tried to corner me in a pantry. I ran from a town that called me a whore because I wouldn't marry a man I hated." She took a ragged breath. "I have never stopped running long enough to just be—" Mako watched her, his eyes soft. "You have stopped now." Liza looked down at her hands, the mismatched gloves now tattered and stained. "I have never been kissed," she trembled, the confession tearing out of her throat like a sob. "I have never been kissed, Mako, not because no one wanted to, but because I never felt safe enough to close my eyes. I never found a place where I didn't have to watch the door." Silence stretched between them, heavy and sweet. Mako did not laugh. He did not look at her with pity. He looked at her as if she had just handed him a fragile bird that he had to keep alive. A slow smile touched his lips, transforming his fierce face into something breathtakingly handsome. It was not a mocking smile. It was the smile of a man who suddenly sees a path through the wilderness. He leaned in slightly, shifting his weight so he faced her fully. "Then let me fix that," he said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in her bones. Real slow. He did not lunge. He raised his hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His fingers were rough, calloused from bowstrings and reins, but his touch was light as a feather. He traced the line of her jaw, giving her 1,000 chances to pull away. Liza did not pull away. For the first time in her life, she did not look at the door. She looked at him. She saw the scar above his eyebrow, the depth of his dark eyes, the promise of a man who did not lie. She closed her eyes. When his lips touched hers, it was not an explosion, it was an arrival. It was warm and firm and tasted of coffee and the wild sage. It was a question asked and answered in the same breath. He kissed her with a patience that undid her, a slow, deliberate exploration that claimed nothing she did not offer. Liza stopped shaking. The fear that had lived in her stomach for 8 years evaporated, replaced by a heat that curled her toes. She reached up, her hand tangling in his long hair, pulling him closer. When they finally pulled apart, neither of them moved. Their foreheads rested against each other, breathing the same air. "You are safe," Mako whispered against her skin. "With me, you are safe." Liza opened her eyes. The world was the same, the rocks, the stars, the danger waiting at dawn, but she was different. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. "We have to go back," she said, her voice steady now. "We have to stop him. We will," Mako promised. But not tonight. They did not sleep together in the way the world would expect. They sat side by side, his arm around her, watching the moon track across the sky. They talked about strategy. They built a plan not on romance, but on the cold, hard necessity of war. They would ride at first light. They would bypass the main road and take the goat trails that led to the back of the Double R Ranch. They knew Boone was planning a gathering at the ranch tomorrow at noon, a signing ceremony. where he would force Wade and the neighboring ranchers to sign over their deeds under the guise of protection. That was the moment to strike. But the morning brought a twist that shattered their calm. Just as the sun crested the canyon walls, a rider thundered into the camp. It was a young Comanche scout, his horse lathered with sweat. He slid to the ground, gasping for air. "Mako!" the scout yelled. "They have the boy!" Mako was there in a second, gripping the scout's arm. "What boy?" "The one called Tommy, the orphan who works the stables at the ranch. Boone's men took him. They are holding him at the old mission ruins near the river." Liza froze. Tommy was 12 years old. He was a scrawny kid who followed her around the kitchen like a stray puppy, begging for biscuit scraps. He had nothing to do with this. "Why?" Liza asked. "They left a message," the scout said. Looking at Liza, "They said the cook has until sunset to bring the bag to the mission. If she does not come, they will hang the boy as a horse thief." It was a trap. It was a crude, brutal trap designed to flush them out into the open. The mission ruins were miles from the ranch, in the opposite direction of where they needed to be. If they went for Tommy, they would miss the signing ceremony, and Boone would get the land. If they went to the ranch, Tommy would die. Mako looked at Liza. His face was grim. He knew the tactical choice was to sacrifice the pawn to save the kingdom. He knew that in war, one boy does not outweigh 100 families, but he also knew Liza. "We cannot let him die," Liza said. There was no hesitation in her voice. "He is innocent." "It is a trap," Mako said. "Boone will have men waiting in the rocks. He wants to kill us in the dark before we can show the papers to anyone." "Then we don't walk into the trap," Liza said, her mind sharpening like a blade. "We spring it." She grabbed a stick and drew a line in the dirt. "The mission has a cellar. I hid there once during a storm. If we can get in from the riverside, under the collapsed wall, we can get Tommy out before they know we are there." "And the signing?" Mako asked. "We cannot do both." "We can if we ride like the devil," Liza said. "We get Tommy. We send him to the sheriff's rival in the next county with the letter. Then we ride to the ranch and stall Boone until help comes." It was a desperate plan. It required perfect timing and luck they did not have. Mako looked at her. He saw the woman who had trembled at a touch last night now commanding a war room in the dirt. He grinned, a fierce, reckless expression. "You have the heart of a warrior. Liza Bennett," he said. They rode out 10 minutes later. The journey to the mission was a blur of speed. They pushed the horses hard, navigating the treacherous scree slopes and jumping fallen logs. As night fell, they reached the river. The old mission stood on a bluff, its adobe walls crumbling. Campfires burned in the courtyard, illuminating the silhouettes of men with rifles. Mako signaled for silence. They dismounted and crept through the reeds along the riverbank. The water was freezing, rising to their waists, but they moved without splashing. They found the breach in the wall that Liza had remembered. It was small, choked with vines, but passable. Mako went first, his knife drawn. He silenced a guard who was dozing by the wall with a sleeper hold, lowering the man gently to the ground. They found Tommy tied to a pillar in the sanctuary. The boy was beaten, his face swollen, but he was alive. When he saw Liza, he started to cry, but she pressed a finger to her lips. Mako cut the ropes. "Can you ride?" he whispered. "Yes, sir," Tommy squeaked. "Take my horse," Mako said. "Ride to the marshal in Lincoln County. Give him this." He handed Tommy the envelope with the letter, not the ledger, just the letter. "Do not stop. Do not look back." They got the boy out through the cellar breach. As Tommy scrambled up the bank to where the horses were hidden, a loose stone clattered loudly. "Hey!" a voice shouted from the courtyard. "Someone is down there." "Go!" Mako slapped the rump of the horse as Tommy mounted. The boy rode off into the dark. Gunshots erupted from the mission walls, bullets kicking up dirt around them. "Now we run!" Liza yelled. They had one horse left, Liza's roan. Mako swung up into the saddle and pulled Liza up behind him. The horse groaned under the double weight but surged forward. Boone's men were already mounting up. The chase was on. They tore through the brush, branches whipping their faces. The pursuers were close. Liza could hear their curses and the crack of their Winchesters. Mako steered the horse off the trail, diving down a steep ravine that no sane man would ride at a gallop. The horse slid on its haunches, sparks flying from its shoes, but they hit the bottom running. They gained a lead, but the ranch was still 10 miles away, and the sun would be up in a few hours. They stopped briefly at a creek to let the horse blow. Liza slid down, her hands shaking again, but this time from adrenaline. Mako checked the horse's flanks. He looked at Liza. She was scratched, bleeding from a cut on her cheek, and covered in river mud. He walked over to her and took her face in his hands. The chaos of the chase faded for a second. "Listen to me," he said, his voice intense and low, anchoring her to the earth. "We are going to ride into that ranch. We are going to stand in front of Boone and his guns. It might be the last thing we do." "I know," Liza said. "But if we live," Mako said, looking deep into her eyes. "If we live through this day, I am not letting you walk away. I am not going to be a memory you keep in a box." He pressed his forehead against hers. "I choose you, Liza. Not for the fight, not for the night. I choose you for the time when the guns are quiet. I choose you for all the days." It was a promise heavier than gold, more binding than any paper Boone could sign. Liza gripped his wrists. "Then you better keep us alive, cowboy, because I plan on collecting." Mako laughed, a short, sharp sound of defiance. He swung back onto the horse and pulled her up. They turned the horse toward the Double R Ranch, riding into the teeth of the dawn, ready to burn Boone's kingdom to the ground with nothing but the truth and a single ledger. The sun hung directly overhead, a blinding white eye staring down at the Double R Ranch. It was high noon, the hour when shadows vanished and sins were laid bare against the hard-packed earth. The wind had died, leaving the air still and heavy with the scent of dust and fear. Silas Boone had turned the ranch yard into a courtroom of his own making. He sat in a high-backed velvet chair that had been dragged out of the bunkhouse, looking absurdly regal in his tailored gray suit amidst the cow dung and timber. Flanking him were Sheriff Harlan and 6 hired gunsmen with cold eyes and hands that hovered near their hips. In front of them, Wade Carver was on his knees. His face was a ruin of purple bruises, and blood trickled from a cut above his eye, dripping onto his dusty shirt. His hands were tied behind his back. The other cowboys of the Double R stood in a loose semicircle, guarded by Boone's men. They looked defeated, their hats pulled low, their eyes darting between their beaten boss and the grim rifles pointed at their chests. "This is unnecessary theater, Wade," Boone said, his voice smooth and cultured, contrasting sharply with the violence of the scene. He held a fountain pen in one hand and the asset protection agreement in the other. "I am merely trying to bring order to a chaotic territory. You are standing in the way of progress. You are standing in the way of the train, the telegraph, and the future." Wade spat a mouthful of blood onto the ground near Boone's polished boots. "You ain't the future, Boone. You're just a thief in a fancy coat." Boone sighed, a sound of exaggerated patience. "Sheriff, explain the situation to Mr. Carver again." Sheriff Harlan stepped forward, his tin star catching the sunlight. "You are harboring a fugitive. Wade, that girl, Eliza, stole $5,000 from the bank and fled by refusing to sign over the management of this property. You are proving yourself complicit in her crimes. We can hang you for that, right here, right now." The threat hung in the air, heavy as lead. The cowboys shifted uneasily. They were good men with ropes and branding irons, but they were not soldiers, and they were watching their leader bleed. "Sign the paper, Wade," one of the older hands muttered, his voice cracking. "It ain't worth dying for." Boone smiled, a thin, triumphant curving of his lips. "Listen to your men. Wade, be reasonable. Sign the transfer. I will pay off your debts, rebuild your barn, and you can retire to a nice little porch in Santa Fe." He stepped forward, thrusting the paper and pen toward Wade. "No!" a voice rang out. It was not a shout. It was spoken with the clear, ringing tone of a bell struck in a quiet valley. Every head turned toward the gate of the corral. Liza Bennett stood there. She looked nothing like the frightened girl who had scrubbed pots a week ago. Her dress was torn at the hem. Her face was smeared with river mud and soot, and her hair hung in wild tangles around her shoulders. But her back was straight, and in her hands she held not a ladle, but a thick, leather-bound ledger and a crumpled envelope. She walked into the yard, her boots thudding softly on the dirt. She did not look at the weapon. She looked directly at Silas Boone. "Liza, run!" Wade croaked, struggling against his bonds. "I am done running." "Wade," Liza said calmly. She stopped 10 paces from Boone. Boone's eyes narrowed. Well, the little thief returns. Sheriff, arrest her." "I wouldn't do that," Liza said. She held the ledger up high. "Not unless you want everyone here to know exactly how much you paid Judge Halloway on October the 4th. The sheriff froze. Boone's smile flickered and died. "That is stolen property." Boone snapped. "Give it to me." "It is a ledger of bribes," Liza announced. Turning to face the cowboys and the few townspeople Boone had brought along as witnesses to his legal transfer. "It lists every dollar Silas Boone has paid to steal this valley. It lists the $50 paid to the clerk to lose the Miller deed. It lists the $200 paid to the sheriff to look the other way when the barn was torched." "She is lying," Harlan shouted, his hand going to his gun. "She is a hysterical woman." "And this," Liza continued, her voice rising, "is a letter signed by Boone himself. It orders the notary, Mr. Abernathy, to forge the dates on the water rights claims." She pointed a shaking finger at a small, balding man standing near the sheriff's horse mister. Abernathy, the town notary, who looked as if he might faint. "Mr. Abernathy is standing right there. Ask him if the seal on the Miller deed is real, or if he melted the wax himself in Boone's back office." All eyes turned to Mr. Abernathy. The little man was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked at Boone, then at the sheriff, and finally at Liza, who stood alone and defiant. Abernathy stammered. I was told it was legal. I was told—" "Shut up, you fool," Boone hissed. "He told me he would kill my wife," Abernathy screamed suddenly, the fear bursting out of him. "He said he would burn my house down if I didn't stamp the papers. It is all fake, all of it." The yard erupted in murmurs. The cowboys looked at each other, their fear turning to anger. The veneer of legality Boone had carefully constructed was shattering. "Enough," Boone roared. His face, usually so composed, was twisted into a mask of rage. "This is a farce. That woman is a criminal killer." He pulled a derringer from his vest pocket, a small, cowardly gun for close range. He leveled it at Liza's chest. Liza did not move. She did not flinch. She stared down the barrel, her eyes blazing. Crack! A gunshot echoed, but it did not come from Boone. A bullet struck the dirt inches from Boone's boot, kicking up a cloud of dust. "Drop it!" a deep voice commanded from the roof of the bunkhouse. Mako rose from behind the chimney, his Winchester leveled at Boone's heart. At the same moment, 3 other Comanche warriors materialized from the haylofts and the top of the corral fence. They had not ridden in screaming. They had ghosted into position while everyone was watching Liza. They held the high ground. "You move, you die," Mako said. His voice was cold iron. Boone froze. He looked up at the Indian, then back at his hired guns. His men were hesitating. They were paid to shoot cowboys, not to fight a war against Comanche snipers who had the drop on them. "This is my land," Boone screamed, his composure completely gone. "I bought it. I own the law." "You own nothing but a lie," Liza said. She took a step closer. "The game is over. Boone, we sent a copy of the letter to the U.S. Marshal in Lincoln County. He is riding here now." It was a bluff Tommy had never made it, but Liza delivered it with the conviction of a saint. Boone's eyes darted around like a trapped rat. He saw the doubt in his men's faces. He saw the hatred in Wade's eyes. He saw the barrel of Mako's rifle. He lunged, but he didn't lunge at Liza. He spun around and grabbed the person nearest to him, a small, huddled figure that his men had dragged out of the stables earlier. It was Tommy. The boy had not escaped. He had been intercepted at the ridge line before he could even reach the main road. His face was swollen. His lips split. Boone wrapped an arm around Tommy's neck and jammed the derringer against the boy's temple. "Back off," Boone shrieked. "Back off or I spill his brains on the dirt." The yard went deathly silent. Mako lowered his rifle slightly, his finger hovering over the trigger, but he could not take the shot. Boone was using the boy's head to shield his own. "Let him go," Liza said, her voice trembling for the first time. "He is a child." "He is my ticket out of here," Boone yelled, backing toward the horses. "Sheriff, get the men ready. We are leaving. And if anyone follows, the boy dies." Sheriff Harlan looked at Boone, then at the angry cowboys, then at the Comanche warriors. He slowly took his hands away from his gun belt. This wasn't part of the deal. Silas, killing a kid, that brings the cavalry. "I pay you to obey," Boone shouted. "Move!" But the sheriff didn't move. Boone was alone. Liza looked at Tommy. The boy was terrified, his eyes wide and pleading. She looked at Boone. He was sweating, his finger whitening on the trigger. He was going to kill the boy. She could see it in his eyes, the desperation of a man who realized his power was an illusion. Liza had a Colt revolver tucked into her waistband, a heavy, rusted thing Wade had given her weeks ago for snakes. She had never fired it at a man. If she drew it, she would have to kill. She would have to become the thing she hated. She would have to take a life to save one. No, she thought. That is his way. Not mine. She looked at Mako. He was watching her, his body coiled tight. He gave a barely perceptible nod, signaling he was ready for whatever she did. Liza took a breath. She let her shoulders slump. She lowered the ledger. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, Boone, you win. Take the papers. Just let the boy go." She tossed the ledger onto the ground between them. It landed with a heavy thud, kicking up a puff of dust. Boone's eyes flickered down to the book, the evidence that could hang him. It was a reflex. Greed. For a fraction of a second, his gaze left the crowd to check the prize. "Now!" Liza screamed. She didn't draw her gun. She grabbed a handful of the fine, powdery dirt from her apron pocket flour she had scooped up from a spilled sack near the gate and flung it with all her strength. The white cloud hit Boone in the face. It wasn't a bullet, but it was blinding. Boone coughed, squeezing his eyes shut instinctively. "Tommy, drop!" Mako roared from the roof. Tommy, street-smart and quick, didn't need to be told twice. He went limp, becoming a dead weight in Boone's arm. Boone stumbled, his grip slipping. Bang! Boone's gun went off, but the bullet went wide, burying itself in the dirt as Tommy scrambled away on hands and knees. Mako leaped from the roof. He did not land on his feet. He landed on Boone. It was a collision of bone and fury. The two men hit the ground hard, rolling in the dust. Boone flailed, trying to aim his gun, but Mako's hand was a vice around his wrist. The hired guns raised their rifles, but the Double R cowboys were ready now. "Drop 'em!" Wade yelled. Having broken his bonds in the chaos, he snatched a shotgun from the nearest deputy and leveled it. "Drop 'em or you die where you stand." The hired guns looked at Wade, then at the Comanche warriors above them. They dropped their weapons. They were mercenaries, not martyrs. In the dust, the fight was short. Boone was a man of soft hands and power. Mako was a man of the earth. Mako twisted Boone's arm until the bone snapped with a wet crack. Boone screamed, dropping the gun. Mako pinned him, his knife drawn, the blade resting against Boone's throat. For a second, the world held its breath. Mako's chest heaved. He looked down at the man who had tried to erase his people. The desire to cut, to end the threat forever, was a visible heat rising off him. "Do it!" Boone wheezed, blood on his teeth. "Kill me! Prove you are the savage!" Mako's hand trembled. He looked up. He found Liza in the crowd. She was kneeling beside Tommy, checking the boy for wounds, but her eyes were on Mako. She did not look away. She did not scream for him to stop, nor did she cheer for blood. She simply witnessed him. She trusted him to choose who he wanted to be. Mako looked back at Boone. He withdrew the knife slowly. "No," Mako said, standing up and spitting on the ground next to Boone's head. "You are not worth the stain on my blade." He turned to the sheriff, who was standing with his hands raised. "Arrest him, Harlan, or the next rope will be for you." Harlan swallowed hard. He pulled a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. The wind had changed. Boone was finished, and Harlan was a survivor. He walked over and clicked the metal around Boone's wrists. "Silas Boone," Harlan mumbled. "You are under arrest for attempted murder, kidnapping, and fraud." Boone lay in the dirt, his expensive suit ruined, his arm broken, staring up at the white sun that didn't care about his money. Liza stood up. Her legs felt like water. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving her shaking. Mako walked over to her. He did not care about the cowboys watching. He did not care about the lawmen. He stopped in front of her, his presence a wall against the rest of the world. "You threw flour," he said, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "I am a cook," Liza said, her voice cracking. "I use what I have." Mako looked at the white dust on his buckskins, then at her fierce, tear-streaked face. He reached out and wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek. "It was a good throw," he said. Wade Carver limped over, rubbing his wrists. He looked at the scene, the defeated tyrant, the shamed sheriff, the Comanche warriors lowering their rifles. He looked at Liza, really seeing her for the first time not as a stray, but as the iron spine of the ranch. "Well," Wade grunted, spitting blood again, "I reckon you earned your $20 this month. Liza." Liza looked at Wade, then at Mako. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of sage and victory. "I reckon I did, Wade, but the price of my biscuits just went up." The tension broke. A few cowboys laughed, a nervous, relieved sound. Tommy was safe. The land was safe. But as the sheriff dragged Boone toward the wagon, Liza saw the look in Boone's eyes. It wasn't a regret. It was a cold, patient hatred. He was beaten, but he was alive, and men like Boone did not forgive. "It is not over," Mako said softly, reading her thoughts. "No," Liza agreed, her hand brushing against his. "But for today, we won." She watched as the notary, Mr. Abernathy, timidly picked up the ledger from the dust, holding it like a holy relic. The truth was out. The ink had dried. And for once, the paper had saved the people, instead of destroying them. Liza looked down at her mismatched gloves. She took them off, one by one, and let them drop to the ground. She didn't need to hide her hands anymore. She didn't need to hide anything. "Come on," she said to Mako. "Let's go make some coffee. I think the boys are hungry." Mako smiled, the slow, rare smile that made her heart stutter. "After you, boss." They walked toward the kitchen together, leaving the guns and the gold behind them, walking into the simple, honest work of living. The dust from Silas Boone's arrest did not settle in a day. It hung in the air over the Double R Ranch like the aftermath of a stampede, a thick and choking reminder of how close they had all come to being trampled. In the 48 hours following the confrontation, the ranch became a place divided. The euphoria of the victory faded quickly, replaced by the grim reality of broken fences, a burned barn, and a future that was no longer guaranteed by Boone's silver. Liza Bennett stood at the pump in the yard, washing the soot from her spare dress. The water was cold, biting her red knuckles, but she scrubbed with a rhythmic intensity. Behind her, she could hear the murmurs of the men near the corral. "We could have had a payout," Slim's voice drifted over, sour and sharp. Boone was offering steady money. Now what do we have, a charred pile of wood and a boss with a broken face? All because a cook and an Indian decided to play the hero. "Shut your mouth, Slim," came the retort from Shorty, one of the older hands who had helped Wade hold the line. "Boone would have skinned us all eventually. At least we own our saddles today." "Do we?" Slim spat. "Wait until the bank comes calling. Boone owns the bank too, even from a cell." Liza stopped scrubbing. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. She felt the eyes of the men on her back. Some looked at her with a newfound respect, tipping their hats when she passed. But others, like Slim, looked at her with a quiet, seething resentment. To them, she was not a savior. She was the woman who had kicked over the anthill. She had disrupted the hierarchy. And men like Slim preferred a comfortable tyranny to a dangerous freedom. She did not turn around to argue. She picked up her wet laundry and walked back to the kitchen. She had learned that you could not convince a dog to stop barking by barking back. You simply closed the gate. Inside the kitchen, Mako was sitting at the table. He was shirtless, his torso wrapped in clean white linen. The fight with Boone had left him with 2 cracked ribs and a deep gash on his left forearm, where he had taken a bad fall against a rock. He was sharpening his knife, the stone making a rhythmic shh sound against the steel. He looked up as she entered. His face was stoic, but his eyes were tired. "They are talking," Mako said. It was not a question. "Let them talk," Liza said, hanging the wet dress on a line she had strung near the stove. "Talk is cheap. Flour costs money, and we are low on flour." Mako set the knife down. "The sheriff sent a rider. You have to go to town tomorrow. The federal magistrate is coming from Santa Fe. They need your testimony to keep Boone in chains." Liza froze for a second. The town, the place of laws and judges and men in suits who looked at women like her as if they were invisible. "I will go," she said, her voice steady. "I will ride with you," Mako said. "You can't." Liza turned to him. "If you ride into town with me, carrying a weapon, they will use it to scare the jury. They will say I am being coerced by a savage. Blackwood, the lawyer, is still free. He will twist everything." Mako stood up. He crossed the small space between them. He did not touch her, but his presence was a warm wall against the cold draft. "I do not care what they say. Boone has long arms. I am not letting you ride that road alone." "I am not afraid of the road anymore," Liza said. She looked at his bandaged arm. "And you are hurt. If you fight now, you will be slow." "I am fast enough," Mako replied. "No," Liza said firmly. "You ride to the edge of town. You watch the trail, but I walk into that courtroom alone. I have to do this, Mako. I have to show them that I am not hiding behind anyone. Not Boone, and not you." Mako studied her face. He saw the steel in her jaw, the same steel that had made her throw flour in a gunman's eyes. He nodded slowly. "To the edge of town," he agreed. The town of Dry Creek was buzzing like a kicked hive. The arrest of Silas Boone was the biggest news since the end of the war. The street was lined with curious onlookers as Liza rode in on the buckboard wagon, Wade Carver driving the team. Wade's face was still a mess of purple and yellow bruises, but he sat upright, defying anyone to comment. Mako was not visible. He had peeled off a mile back, taking the high ridge that overlooked the town. Liza knew he was there. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck, a tether that kept her grounded. She walked up the steps of the courthouse, a small brick building that smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. She wore her clean dress, mended carefully. She wore no hat to hide her face. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Mr. Blackwood sat at the defense table, looking like a vulture in a silk suit. Boone was not there. He was being held in the county jail for security, but his presence filled the room. When Liza took the stand, Blackwood stood up. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "Miss Bennett," Blackwood began, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Is it true that you are a transient, that you have no fixed address, no family, and no employment history longer than 3 months in any one town?" "It is true that I have moved often," Liza said clearly. "And is it true," Blackwood continued, pacing in front of the jury, "that you were seen fleeing the scene of a fire in the company of a hostile Comanche warrior, a man known to be an enemy of peace?" The courtroom murmured. This was the trap. Paint her as a woman of loose morals, a traitor to her race, and her testimony about the ledger would be dismissed as the lies of a fallen woman. Liza looked at the jury. 12 men. Ranchers, shopkeepers, men who likely feared Indians and didn't trust independent women. "I was fleeing a fire set by your client's men," Liza said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "And the man I was with is the only reason I am alive to sit in this chair. You call him hostile. I call him a man who kept his word when the sheriff was selling his badge for silver." Blackwood stiffened. "Objection. The witness is speculating." "I am not speculating on the ledger," Liza said, turning to the judge. "I can read. Your Honor, I read the names, I read the amounts. And I saw the notary. Mr. Abernathy, weep when he admitted the seals were fake. You can judge me for who I ride with, but that does not change the ink on the paper." She did not cry. She did not beg for their belief. She laid the truth out like a meal on a table. Take it or leave it. The magistrate, a stern man with a gray beard, looked at her over his spectacles. He looked at Blackwood, who was sputtering. "The witness will step down," the magistrate said. "The ledger has been authenticated. The testimony stands." Liza walked out of the courtroom. She did not run. She felt the eyes of the town on her, but for the first time, they did not feel like knives. They felt like nothing, just eyes. She had faced fire and a man with a gun. The judgment of strangers no longer held any power over her. That evening, Mako sat by a small fire in the hills above the ranch. Old Nita had ridden down from the canyon to bring herbs for his arm. She applied a poultice of crushed leaves to the swelling, her gnarled hands working with surprising gentleness. "The bone is knitting," Nita said, "but the spirit is restless." Mako stared into the flames. "Boone is in a cage, but there are other Boones. The railroad is still coming. The surveyors are still measuring the valley. The wolf always comes," Nita said, wiping her hands on a rag. "That is the way of the world. You cannot kill the winter. Mako, you can only build a shelter that holds—" "I do not know if I can build a shelter here," Mako said. "The cowboys look at me with hate. The town looks at me with fear. If I stay, I am a target. If I go—" "If you go, you leave the girl," Nita finished. Mako did not answer. "You love her," Nita stated. It wasn't a question. "I saw how you looked at her when she threw the flower. You looked like a man who had found water in the desert." "She is white," Mako said. "Her world will never accept me. If I stay, I drag her down. They will call her a savage woman. They will shun her." Old Nita hit him on the shin with her cane. It hurt. "Stupid boy." She cackled. "You think she cares about their tea parties? She is a woman who walked through fire. Do not insult her by deciding what she can handle. You think leaving her protects her. Leaving her breaks her. To choose a person is to choose the war that comes with them. You do not fight the world for her. You fight the world with her." Mako rubbed his shin. He looked toward the lights of the ranch house down in the valley. "I have been a scout, a warrior, a ghost. I do not know how to be a husband." "Then learn," Nita said, standing up. "It is harder than tracking elk, but it keeps you warmer at night." The next morning, Liza stood on the porch of the main house. Wade Carver was sitting in a rocking chair, nursing a cup of coffee. His face was healing, the purple fading to a sickly green. "The magistrate denied bail," Wade said. "Boone is being moved to the territorial prison next week. Blackwood is trying to appeal, but the evidence is too heavy." "That is good," Liza said. "Liza." Wade set his cup down. "The boys, they are idiots, but they know you saved the ranch. The kitchen is yours if you want it. I will raise your pay to $25. You have a roof. You have a job." Liza looked out at the horizon. The sun was rising over the ridge, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, and it was harsh. "I can't take the job, Wade," she said. Wade looked surprised. "Why you need the money?" "I can't work for you anymore," Liza said gently. "I can't live in the back of a bunkhouse, listening to Slim complain, waiting for the next boss to decide if I am useful. I am done being a servant." "Then what will you do? Go back to the city?" "No." Liza pointed a finger toward the south, where the main trail curved around a stand of cottonwood trees near the creek. It was a patch of land that belonged to the ranch but was too rocky for grazing. "I want that piece of land, 2 acres, right by the road." Wade frowned, looking at the spot. "That scrub patch?" What for? I want to build a place, Liza said. A roadhouse. A place where travelers can get a meal that isn't burnt beans. A place where the coffee is hot and the bread is fresh. I will buy the land from you. I will work off the debt by cooking for the ranch crew until it is paid. But the deed goes in my name, Eliza Bennett. She turned to Wade. I want a place where no one can tell me to leave. A place where a woman isn't priced by rumors, but by the quality of her stew. Wade scratched his beard. He looked at the rocky patch, then back at Liza. He saw the set of her jaw. He realized that if he said no, she would walk away, and he would lose the best cook and the bravest woman he had ever known. It is rocky, Wade warned. Building a foundation there will be hell. I know a man who is good with stone, Liza said, a small smile touching her lips. Wade chuckled. It was a rusty sound. $30 an acre. You cook for the boys for 6 months. And we call it square. I will have the lawyer draw up the paper. A real paper this time. Deal, Liza said. She held out her hand. Wade shook it. It was a handshake between equals. 2 days later, Liza and Mako walked into Dry Creek together. They needed supplies nails, a hammer, a sack of seed corn for a small garden. This time, Mako did not stay on the ridge. He walked beside her. He wore his buckskins, his knife on his belt, his head high. He did not walk 3 paces behind like a servant. He walked shoulder to shoulder. The town went quiet. A woman sweeping the boardwalk stopped and stared. 2 men outside the saloon ceased their conversation, their eyes narrowing. A mixed couple, a white woman and a Comanche warrior walking openly down Main Street, was an affront to the unspoken laws of the territory. A murmur started, a low buzz of disapproval. Look at that, a voice hissed. No shame. Turning Indian, another sneered. Liza felt her spine stiffen. Her instinct was to look down, to hurry, but she felt Mako's presence beside her. He was calm. He was not reacting to the whispers. He was simply existing, occupying his space in the world without apology. He stopped in the middle of the street. He turned his head and looked directly at the men by the saloon. He did not touch his weapon. He just looked at them with a flat, unimpressed gaze that said, I have fought bears and blizzards. Your words are nothing. Liza stopped with him. She looked at the woman with the broom. She smiled, a polite, devastatingly normal smile. Good morning, Mrs. Gable, Liza said. Lovely weather for sweeping. Mrs. Gable blinked, flustered by the normalcy. Yes, I suppose. Liza turned to Mako. We need nails. Mako, 10 pounds. 10 pounds, Mako repeated, his voice deep and audible to everyone. They continued walking. They did not hurry. By the time they reached the general store, the murmurs had died down, replaced by a confused silence. They had not fought the town. They had simply refused to accept the town's shame. They bought their supplies. As they loaded the mule they had brought, Mako leaned in close to her. Old Nita was right, he murmured. About what? Liza asked. Securing a bag of flour. That fighting the world with you is better. They left the town, heading back toward the ranch road. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the trail. The road passed through a narrow cut in the hills, a place known as Devil's Elbow. Liza was tired but happy. She was thinking about the foundation of her roadhouse. She didn't see the flash of metal in the rocks above, but Mako did. Down, he shouted. He didn't shove her this time. He spun, drawing his revolver in a fluid motion. Bang, a bullet kicked up dirt right where Liza had been standing a second before. She threw herself behind the mule, pulling her own rusted Colt. 2 men emerged from the rocks, rough men, dusters flapping. They were not Boone's usual hired guns. They were cheap drifters, likely paid a last desperate bounty by Blackwood to silence the witness before the appeal. Get the girl, one shouted, scrambling down the scree slope. This was not the panicked flight of the night the barn burned. This was different. Left side, Liza called out, steadying her gun on the mule's saddle. I have the right, Mako answered. They moved like a single organism. Liza fired. Her shot went wide, but it pinned the man on the left, forcing him to dive behind a cactus. It gave Mako the second he needed. Mako did not miss. He fired once. The man on the right spun around, his shoulders shattering, and dropped his rifle. The second man popped up, aiming at Mako. Liza adjusted her aim. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't tremble. She exhaled. Bang! Her bullet struck the rock inches from the man's face, sending stone fragments into his eyes. He screamed, clutching his face, and scrambled backward. Retreating up the hill, "Go!" the wounded man yelled to his partner. "They fight like devils." The attackers fled, scrambling over the ridge and disappearing into the Badlands. They had expected a helpless woman and a savage. They had found a fortress. Mako did not chase them. He kept his gun raised until the sound of their boots faded completely. Then he lowered the hammer and holstered the weapon. He turned to Liza. She was standing up, dusting off her dress. She checked the mule. The mule was fine. "You shoot high," Mako noted, walking over to her. "I was aiming for his hat." Liza lied, her hands shaking just a little now that it was over. Mako took her hands. He held them steady. "You held your ground." "I have something to defend now," Liza said. She looked at the supplies on the mule, the seeds of her future. Mako looked at the empty trail ahead. The danger wasn't gone forever. There would always be men like Boone, or desperate drifters, or hard winters. But the fear that had ruled their lives, the fear of being alone, of being hunted, was gone. "Let's go home," Mako said. "To the ranch?" Liza asked. Mako looked at the rocky patch of land by the cottonwoods, visible in the distance. "To the roadhouse," he corrected. They took the reins of the mule together and walked down the center of the road. The sun set behind them, casting two long shadows that merged into one, stretching out toward a future that they would build, stone by stone, with their own hands. The seasons turned 4 times, grinding the harsh edges off the memory of the fire and the trial. Spring arrived in the territory not with a gentle bloom, but with a stubborn insistence, pushing green shoots through the hard-packed earth where the snow had finally retreated. It was 1880, where once there had been only a rocky patch of scrub oak and a dream. There now stood a building. It was not a palace, nor was it the rough-hewn shanty of a squatter. It was a sturdy structure of river stone and timber, built to withstand the wind that came howling down from the divide. A hand-painted sign swung above the wide porch. Creaking rhythmically in the breeze, Bennett's Crossing. The air around the roadhouse did not smell of cattle or manure. It smelled of salvation. It smelled of cornbread rising in a cast-iron skillet, of venison stew simmering with wild onions and sage, and of coffee so dark and rich it could wake a man from a coma. Liza Bennett stood behind the long wooden counter, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her hands, once blistered and shaking from gripping a rusted revolver, were now dusted with flour. She moved with a fluid, commanding grace, sliding a plate of hot biscuits toward a weather-beaten drover who looked like he hadn't seen a home-cooked meal in 6 months. "Eat slow, Mr. Henderson," Liza said, her voice calm and authoritative. "The stew isn't going anywhere, and neither are you." The drover, a man named Henderson, who usually spoke only to his horse, looked up at her with eyes full of reverence. "Yes, ma'am. It just smells. It smells like my mother's kitchen. If you don't mind me saying." "I don't mind," Liza said, pouring him a fresh cup of coffee. "That is the point." The roadhouse was full. It was midday, and the stagecoach from Santa Fe had just stopped, along with 3 freight wagons heading north. 2 years ago, a woman alone serving food to this rough crowd would have been the subject of lewd jokes and grabbing hands. But the air in Bennett's Crossing was different. Here, a man took off his hat when he entered. He wiped his boots on the scraper outside. He did not curse loudly, and he certainly did not touch the proprietress. They didn't behave this way because of a sheriff or a lawman. They behaved this way because Liza Bennett demanded it. Not with a gun, but with the sheer force of her dignity. She looked every man in the eye, treating him like a human being rather than a wallet or a threat. In return, they found themselves remembering their manners. In the back corner of the room, sitting at a small table near the fireplace, was a boy of perhaps 14. It was Tommy. He was no longer the scrawny, terrified kid held hostage by Silas Boone. He had filled out, his shoulders broadening, and he wore a clean shirt. He was not sweeping floors or hauling manure. He was reading. A copy of the Count of Monte Cristo lay open before him, his finger tracing the lines. Every few minutes, he would scribble a word onto a slate tablet. Liza watched him for a moment, a fierce pride warming her chest. Boone had wanted to use Tommy as a shield, a disposable thing. Now, Tommy was learning that words had power, and that a boy who could read a contract could never be cheated by a man in a suit again. When the lunch rush finally subsided and the stagecoach driver called for his passengers to board, a quiet settled over the room. Liza wiped down the counter, the wood smooth under her palm. She walked to the heavy oak cabinet behind the bar, the one with the sturdy iron lock. She wore the key on a chain around her neck. She opened it to retrieve the cash box, but her hand lingered on the object sitting next to the coins. It was the ledger. The leather cover was cracked now, stained with the oil of the journey and the dirt of the canyon. The pages inside still held the damning rows of numbers that had brought down an empire. Silas Boone was rotting in a territorial prison 300 miles away, breaking rocks in the sun. The ledger was no longer a weapon. It was no longer a death sentence that kept her awake at night, listening for hoofbeats. It was a scar, and like all scars, it was proof that the wound had healed. It was evidence that she had survived, that she had chosen her own life instead of letting fear dictate her path. She ran her thumb over the spine, feeling the texture of the past, then closed the cabinet door and locked it. She didn't need to look at it. She knew what it said. The front door opened, letting in a gust of fresh air and the bright, hard sunlight of the afternoon. The conversation in the room didn't stop, but it shifted. A respectful nod went through the room as Mako stepped inside. He did not look like a cowboy, nor did he try to look like a townsperson. He wore his buckskins, clean and mended, with a red wool blanket draped over one shoulder. His hair was long, tied back with a leather thong. He did not walk with the defensive crouch of a man expecting a fight, but with the easy, long-legged stride of a man walking on his own ground. He carried a canvas sack over his shoulder. He walked straight to the counter. "The pass is clear," Mako said. His voice was low, meant for her. "The snow is gone from the high meadows. My people will move the camp to the summer grounds next week." "And the trade?" Liza asked. "Good," Mako said. He set the sack on the counter. Dried venison, buffalo robes, and the silverwork old Nita promised. Liza opened the sack. The craftsmanship was exquisite. In the last year, Mako became the bridge. He was the only one who could walk freely between the world of the reservation and the world of the town. He brought goods from his people to sell at the roadhouse honest trade that brought money to the tribe and unique goods to the travelers. He brought news from the government agents, translating the bureaucratic lies into truths his people could navigate. He wasn't a tame Indian living in a white woman's house. He was a diplomat, a warrior who had traded his rifle for a map, though Liza knew the rifle was never far from his reach. "Old Nita asks if you are eating enough," Mako said, a hint of a smile touching his eyes. "She says you look like a willow branch." "Tell Nita I eat my own cooking," Liza replied, cutting a slice of warm cornbread and placing it on a plate for him, "which is more than I can say for her rabbit stew." Mako laughed, a rich sound that made the few remaining customers smile into their coffee. He took the cornbread, but he didn't sit. He leaned against the counter, watching her. The connection between them was a tangible thing, a current that ran beneath the floorboards. It wasn't the desperate, clinging need of two people drowning. It was the steady, anchored strength of two trees with roots tangled deep in the same earth. Later that afternoon, a wagon rattled up to the porch. It was Wade Carver. The old trail boss looked better. His nose was slightly crooked from where Boone's men had broken it, and he walked with a limp when the weather turned wet. But he looked lighter. The Double R ranch was smaller now Boone's investors had pulled out, and the herd had been reduced. But it was honest. Wade owned it. truly owned it, without a mortgage held by a thief. He climbed down from the wagon, dusting off his trousers. He carried a crate of eggs. "Afternoon. Liza," Wade called out. "Chickens are lying like they are trying to pay off a gambling debt. Thought you could use these." "I can always use eggs." "Wade," Liza said, coming out to the porch. "I will credit your account." "No need." Wade waved a hand. "Consider the interest on the investment." He looked at the roadhouse, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the flower box Liza had built under the window. In the center of the box, blooming with a defiant burst of yellow, were wild sunflowers. "She would have liked this place," Wade said softly. Liza followed his gaze to the flowers. "June," she said. "June," Wade agreed. "She liked noise. She liked people. She would have sat right there on that rocker and told stories until the sun went down." "I planted the sunflowers for her," Liza said, "because they always turn to the light. No matter where the sun goes, they find it." Wade nodded, clearing his throat. "Well, she sparked the fire, didn't she? You just kept it burning." He tipped his hat to Mako, who was repairing a hinge on the shutter nearby. It was a respectful nod between men who had fought back to back. Wade climbed back into his wagon. "Send Tommy over on Tuesday. I'm teaching him to shoe a horse. Reading is fine, but a man needs to know how to use a hammer too." "He will be there," Liza promised. As evening approached, the roadhouse quieted down. The sun began its long descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of violet and gold. This was the magic hour, the time when the desert looked less like a graveyard and more like a cathedral. Liza sat at one of the large tables near the window. She was not alone. 3 young girls, daughters of a local miner who had lost his leg and his luck, sat across from her. Their clothes were patched and their hands were rough, but their eyes were bright. On the table were bowls of flour, cups of water, and a small slate board. "Now," Liza said, tapping the slate, "if a sack of flour costs $2 and you can make 50 biscuits from it, and you sell 2 biscuits for 5 cents, how much profit have you made?" The girls frowned, counting on their fingers. "Freedom," Liza said gently, catching their attention. "Listen to me. Freedom is not just about running away. Freedom starts with a full belly and a clear head. If you know how to cook, you will never starve. If you know how to count, you will never be cheated. Do you understand?" The oldest girl, a 12-year-old with stringy hair, nodded slowly. "Yes, Miss Liza, because if you can count, you know what you are worth." "Exactly," Liza said. "Never let anyone else write the numbers in your book. You write them yourself." She taught them not just recipes, but the alchemy of independence. She was building an army, not of soldiers, but of women who would not be easily broken. When the girls left, scampering home with loaves of fresh bread wrapped in cloth, Liza walked out onto the porch. The air was cooling rapidly. Mako was there, leaning against the railing, smoking a small pipe. He watched the stars begin to puncture the twilight. Liza stood beside him. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just breathed in the scent of the sage and the pipe smoke. "The sheriff in town," Mako said quietly. "He says the town council wants to pave the main street. They want to call it Boone Avenue because he brought the money, even if he was a crook." Liza snorted. "They can call it what they want. The mud will still swallow it when it rains." "They talk about you too," Mako said. "Oh, what is the gossip this week? That I am a witch, that I keep gold bars under the floor?" "No." Mako turned to look at her. "Mrs. Gable says you are the only woman in the territory who can make a dried bean taste like a meal. And the banker, he says you have better credit than the mayor." Liza smiled, shaking her head. "Funny how people change their tune when you own the roof over your head. They do not just respect the roof, Liza," Mako said. "They respect the pillar that holds it up." He put his pipe away and turned to face her fully. The darkness of the prairie surrounded them, vast and endless, but here on the porch, in the circle of light from the window, there was no fear. "I have to go to the winter camp soon," Mako said. "I will be gone for 2 weeks. The passes will close if I wait." I know, Liza said. She felt the familiar pang of missing him, but it was not the panic of abandonment. When I come back, Mako said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant register that always made her heart stutter. I want to stay, not just for a night, not just for the trade. Liza looked up at him. There is always a bed for you here, Mako, you know that. I do not want a bed as a guest, Mako said. I want to wake up every morning and see you before I see the sun. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused, and warm. I am not a man who owns a farm, he said. I cannot give you a silk dress. I cannot promise that the world will stop looking at us sideways. I have never liked silk, Liza whispered. It tears too easily. I choose you, Lisa, Mako said. It was the same promise he had made during the chase. But now, in the quiet peace of the evening, it carried the weight of a lifetime. Not because I saved you, and not because you saved me. I choose you because you are the only one who stands straight when the wind blows. You are the rock in the river. Liza felt tears prick her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. She looked at this man, this warrior who had fought the world for her, and who had learned to live in a new world for her. And I choose you, she said, her voice steady and sure. I choose the man who knows that land is more than money. I choose the man who taught me that silence isn't empty. Mako smiled, the slow, rare smile that was just for her. He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. Then let's fix the rest of it, he murmured, real slow. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the desperate, adrenaline-fueled kiss of the night in the canyon. It was not the fearful, first kiss of a girl who had never been touched. It was the kiss of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. It was deep, unhurried, and filled with the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. In that kiss, there was the taste of the wind, the heat of the cooking fire, and the solid, unshakable truth of the earth beneath their feet. Liza pulled back, breathless, her hands resting on his chest. She looked out at the road, the dark ribbon winding through the moonlight. It was no longer a path for running away. It was a path that brought people to her door. The coffee will be ready in the morning, she said softly. I will be here to drink it, Mako promised. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they turned to look at the house they had built. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned steadily, casting a warm, golden glow against the glass. It was a beacon in the vast darkness of the west. Liza Bennett, the girl who had arrived with a canvas bag and mismatched gloves, was home. She had won her war, not by burning down the world, but by building a place where the fire was used to feed, not to destroy. And as she stood there, held by the man she had chosen, she knew that this was the only victory that mattered. The wind blew across the plains, whispering through the sagebrush. But Liza did not shiver. She was warm. She was loved. And she was free. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Liza and Mako. It has been a long journey from the dusty plains of 1878 to the warmth of Bennett's Crossing, and I hope you could feel the grit and the heart of the Wild West in every chapter. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment down below and tell me where in the world you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed the ride, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you really want to help these stories reach more people, go ahead and hit that hype button. Your support means the world to me and keeps the campfire burning. Until next time, keep your boots dusty and your heart true.